Welcome back to Founding Footprints, a public history podcast considering the age of revolutions in Charlottesville and Albemarle County here in Virginia in the lead up to the 250th anniversary of July 4th, 1776. I'm historian Ben Bernard. In this episode, we'll hear from Sara Bon-Harper. She is a longtime archaeologist and museum director, currently executive director of Highland, formerly known as Ashlon, the estate of President James Monroe. To remember the revolutionary period here in Charlottesville is to think back on a time when Virginians were at the center of developing what it meant to be American. 4 of the first 5 presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, were all from Virginia. We can also have mixed feelings about that legacy. It's in part because of the existence of a wealthy planter aristocracy that this distinction was possible. 1 president is good luck, 4 is evidence of a system. And I think it's the life and career of James Monroe in particular who shows us how that Virginian story developed in the generation after Jefferson, and that period is due for reconsideration. In our conversation, we'll hear about surprising new discoveries about Highland, about James Monroe's career, and about new approaches to museums today. In particular, I'm struck by how Sara Bon-Harper understands considering the past as a way to think about ourselves, to do self-work, and of course to appreciate how untidy the past was.
I really think the purpose of the 250 is to look forward. Really, the relevance for us of this commemoration, like other commemorations, is to learn from the past but act toward the future. I'm Sara Bon-Harper. I'm the executive director of James Monroe's Highland.
And what is Highland?
Highland is a historic site open to the public year-round. It is a division of William and Mary, one of Virginia's state universities. William and Mary is 120 miles down I-64. It's not next door. But for historical reasons, we are a part of William and Mary.
And so what makes Highland an important or significant historic site?
Highland certainly was preserved as and anchors to the history around James Monroe, the most famous owner of Highland. He owned the property from 1793 till 1828 with some complexity in there, and that he didn't move there until 1799 with his young family and a household of enslaved people. And then he sold the main house and the core property in 1826, and then didn't give up his farming of the fields and the surrounding land until 1828.
I'm curious about the site of Highland itself and what visitors can expect to see there. You know, in America, we have a tradition of house museums that are focused on architecture, decorative arts, and so on. But there's also a kind of European model of chateaus. And it seems like we're sort of straddling both.
Highland and the visitor experience is more complex than that traditional house museum focusing on architecture and the decorative arts. In part because 9 years ago now, we revealed a major research discovery that upended what people thought about the house and how it had been understood.
What was the discovery?
Well, as early as 1885, we find people misunderstood the standing house and called it a remnant wing of a partially destroyed main house at Highland because they had forgotten that Monroe's main house, the 1799 move-in date and all that, had burned down in its entirety. It's surprising that there's not a whole lot of newspaper ink and so forth about the burning of the former home of the former president because he was still alive and tremendously popular at the time. However, they somehow forgot that a later house got built that partially overlapped the footprint, and the standing part got labeled the remnant wing. And so when I arrived in 2012, part of my charge was to sort of develop Highland in a way that would be relevant and have clear history for a varied public. And as an archaeologist myself, I started asking the questions that led to a new research design excavating shovel test pits, little round holes down to subsoil across the property in a grid. And eventually the teams we brought on found these foundations in the front yard of the later 1870s house. And when we opened those up, they turned out to be the main house that had been destroyed by fire and completely forgotten. And so this was a major transformation. At the same time, we were able to point at the little house that was standing, that so-called remnant wing, which was wrong, and say that it was the guest house built during the first full calendar year of Monroe's presidency, and it was built by enslaved men Peter Mallory and George Williams in 1818. So major archaeological discovery, architectural insight, and dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, of the standing house. And poof, we have a brand new story. To transform a historic site in this way in the 21st century is incredible. It is amazing that that history remained shrouded for so long, and that we were able to just hone in on the right pieces of research to clarify, and that the house itself, the foundations that are in the ground, are so beautifully preserved and still there waiting for us.
We knew that this was an important site. We knew of the connection to Monroe, and people looked around at these buildings and didn't really know.
Right. They kind of scratched their head and said, he came back with all his French furniture, and he was this worldly man. He was this sophisticated diplomat and so forth. And really? And so, the house that we've discovered from 1799 is no Monticello, is no Montpelier. Both of those were grand architectural houses, but it was a house suitable for a young man about to become governor of Virginia.
So who was Monroe?
Monroe is a Virginian born in Westmoreland County in 1758. Westmoreland County out there on the northern neck was really a hub of agriculture and economy in the pre-Revolution years. His family had been there for a few generations. His father's family had some status in the community, his mother's as well as money.
And so he comes from this farming background and becomes a founding father, a diplomat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he goes off to William and Mary. I love the story about his first year. He writes about it later in a darling way, and he talks about how he was woefully unprepared for his course of study at William and Mary in his first year. He goes off and revises over the summer and met with his instructor's approval the following year. He made tremendous progress and had to go back and double down on his studies and did really well. He did not stay at William and Mary terribly long. He was there from 1774 to 1776 when he was swept off in this revolutionary fervor, part of the storming of the arsenal and the raiding of the weapons and so forth, and then went off to fight in the Revolution.
Was he a good soldier?
He was. Yeah, he was in important circles there and in a close confidant of some of the leaders. He was an advance guard for George Washington crossing the Delaware and then fighting at the Battle of Trenton. Monroe was one of the few people injured at the Battle of Trenton and nearly died, but for the quick action of a surgeon that they had actually met the night before while crossing their property, and they brought along with him. Then he went on, he recovered and wintered at Valley Forge, fought at many of the major battles of the Northeast. And I think really his service during those years and his proximity to the elder founders, Monroe was a teenager in the time we're talking about, those experiences formed him in a way that I believe solidified his commitment to the United States and its success.
Is it fair to associate him with Jefferson?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, he buys a plot of land next to
which is not a coincidence,
Monticello.
Right? So he meets Jefferson at some point as a young man. In the early years of crafting the structure of the government is close to Jefferson. Jefferson kind of takes him under his wing, providing books, lodging at times.
He's Jefferson's mentee.
Yeah, definitely. As the two men age and go on, it becomes a little more equal later. But definitely, I talked about him not finishing his studies at William and Mary because the Revolution is calling him. And so he goes off and does this. And then in a lovely exchange of letters, he speaks to his uncle, Joseph Jones, who is really his parent figure then because his parents have both died by that point. And shall he go back and study at William and Mary, or shall he read the law with then Governor Jefferson? And I think we know which happens. And he goes and studies with Jefferson, and reading the law is very much a Virginia thing, and he does that, and their fates are solidified then.
Well, I'm struck now by just how many steps in his life he undertakes after Jefferson. So he buys up a plot of land next to Monticello. He'll become governor of Virginia. He becomes ambassador to France under Washington, and then an ambassador to Spain, I think, under Jefferson, and then, of course, becomes elected president.
Right. And in between is governor to France again, and then is Secretary of State, briefly Secretary of War simultaneously, and also serves in Congress. We should, first of all, recognize that these Virginians had an important role in the formation and continuation of the United States, and also this circle of men who had land and power and learning. It really was a circle of men who knew one another and furthered their cause together.
You know, what a lot of folks will learn in school or in history courses in American history is the kind of Jeffersonian vision for an agriculture, farming-based economy that sets up a kind of American political system in which, you know, political power accrues to yeoman farmers who are landowners, white landowners, who vote, who establish property and establish kind of farm-based businesses on the types of land that he and Jefferson held. What's your feeling about that type of vision for America?
Well, certainly only a given number of people can hold land at that level, right? And so it's limiting. This connects specifically to one of our new interpretations in our new exhibition at Highland called Window to a New America, where it's about unfinished revolutions, right? So these concepts and ideals of the American Revolution and who they apply to and how they've been applied, who claims them and uses them successfully or not to create their role in the United States.
And so this is part of the commemoration?
Absolutely. It was completed about a year ago and is done in preparation for 2026 and our understanding of the role of Highland, places like Highland and Virginia in United States history, and should really set the stage for conversations about 2026. And all of this is done with the collaboration of our Council of Descendant Advisors who trace their African-American ancestors to Highland, either in slavery or after the Civil War. And so their perspectives, their wishes for inclusion in content, theme, and tone are included across all of these site spaces at Highland now.
Are there any examples that come to mind?
Absolutely. Maybe we can imagine these presidential sites as something specifically presidential, like ornamental or so forth.
Neoclassical.
Whatever they wanted to express. But really, these were places of economic basis, right? You know, in different places, it would have been a factory. Here, it's economic production through agriculture. And that's the key point. And so what we do in these places is we're talking about sort of the development of Virginia and, you know, from the earliest part that it's about agricultural exploitation, about agricultural product and so forth. And so in one area, we are talking about the labor involved in Highland in particular and growth there. And there's a descendant viewpoint. What was the impact of slavery? And you get a descendant's view on that.
Right, because the agriculture-based economy didn't work without enslaved labor.
Right, enslaved labor was essential there, and it was unpaid labor. And another example is inside the guest house, because, of course, those have all been reinterpreted too. We're talking about the abolitionist movements of the early 1800s in the American Colonization Society. And one of the council said to us, could you do a little more about Liberia and talk about that more and what that means? And so we have dived in just a little bit deeper. You know, this wasn't the removal of formerly enslaved people to their homeland. It was the removal from their homeland, the United States, where their families had lived for generations, to a new place that they didn't know. You know, that council member challenged us to be a little clearer on that and to go a little deeper.
I'd be interested to hear more about the Window to a New America exhibit, the idea of unfinished revolutions. Mm-hmm. What do you think are some of the lessons for today?
One of the things that I find really relevant is the individual role. We are all shaped by the historical moments we live in, and we also shape those moments. So that kind of interaction and that awareness that we are within historical moments at the same time as we are making them. You can look into the glass of a 19th century mirror. The little tag at the bottom of it interrogates you and says, what have you lived through? How are you contributing to history? And sort of to see yourself as also a contributor to history and as living through historical moments. And so the room talks about voting rights. It talks about education. It talks about monuments. It talks about people a generation removed from slavery, accomplishing civic feats. And so really the individual roles in these larger movements that are the events of history, and connecting those individual to larger threads feels really important to me.
I love this idea that visitors to Highland can go there to learn about the early American economy, to learn about the system of enslaved labor, but also to go there and do this kind of self-work.
Right. It makes it a two-way viewing, if you will, where you aren't just viewing the object, it is also challenging you. What we're doing, I hope, is connecting all those people and events to the larger threads of history.
Sometimes when I go to a house museum, I feel like, it can't have always looked this pristine. All the furniture is arranged just so. And when we go about our lives, of course, most people's houses don't have this sort of pristine look, even in an office, right?
We interpreted the other main guest room as though a gentleman visitor had just arrived. His riding boots and hose are by the fireplace. His hat is on a table. His evening clothes are on the bed. We set it up that there's a glass that maybe he's just had a drink and so forth. And there's a newspaper on the floor. And we had a really diligent staff person for a while who would always tidy things in the morning before his shift, and it would always be back on the chair. And I would come in and I would put it on the floor. And finally, we realized who was playing this seesaw game with me. And I said, the reason it's on the floor is to give that sense of motion, that sense of the action just happened. And his thinking was great, too. His thinking was, let's make this space right, and let's make it correct, and let's make it tidy. So I appreciated that very much. But where I land on this is a really interesting observation into how different people interact with these spaces and what they see in them and what they see that we need. What we put into it changes what it is, in essence. Great public history lesson right there, right? It's that two-way. Without the public, it's just history.
Can you tell me about the Highland Descendants Foodways project?
Some of our students worked with our descendant council members and recorded their food traditions and explored some of their traditions and innovations and their relationships with these landscapes and with ecology. That has developed into several different events, one of them being a current project with a team of students. We're developing a pilot program for a foodways program for local kids.
For the last couple minutes, I think this is a great segue. I'd like to ask about some of the other public programs that are happening and will happen at Highland.
First of all, is William & Mary's Year of the Environment. Our public programming this year really maps onto that. We have a series of walks, workshops, a plant swap coming up, and other activities that really focus on the environment and our relationship with it in some way. And so the land is also part of our purview for interpretation and interrogation. And so that's why I feel these are really important to Highland. And so our conservation efforts are a part of what we do and also a part of what we teach and offer to the public. We also, year in and year out have this amazing set of rustic trails, 6 or 7 miles of trails, and it is completely volunteer maintained by an amazing team. And we often host programs on it. Our interest in the environment and agriculture and foodways comes through our exhibits and goes into our programming, including the Albemarle County Fair, which at its heart is the livestock show and auction by 4-H youth in the area. And the VMHC Mobile Museum will be there outside the fee area for everyone to come and see.
After my conversation with Sara Bon-Harper, I began thinking more about the policy for which Monroe is known. The Monroe Doctrine was the president's policy in 1823 that declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to European colonization. He articulated that in his message to Congress on December 2, 1823. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we've not interfered and shall not interfere. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintain it, and whose independence we have on great consideration and just principles acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purposes of oppressing them or controlling in any manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States. There are two interpretations here. If Thomas Jefferson had articulated American independence, Monroe was stating that these values of democratic self-determination and independence from European imperial powers should extend to other countries as well, and that the United States would recognize those struggles. Yet the doctrine also represented an early assertion of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere by claiming to dictate the direction that the hemisphere should go in against the wishes of European colonizing countries, and it sought to preserve the Western Hemisphere as a domain of American influence. Well, why does this matter? In the spring of 2025, headlines have been proclaiming the relevance of the Monroe Doctrine. The Washington Post headline reads, "Trump revives Monroe Doctrine in U.S. relations with Western Hemisphere." The Hill wrote that, quote, "Trump is taking the Monroe Doctrine global." For The Nation, Financial Times, Compact Magazine, all of these publications are commenting on Trump's invocation of the Monroe Doctrine, in implementing aggressive tariffs in the service of economic nationalism, in stating especially territorial ambitions in Greenland and Panama, and of course a less plausible one in Canada. His approach seems grounded in an exaggerated interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine that America should control the hemisphere by right. Understanding this world that Monroe lived in, I think, can help us interpret these foreign policy claims today. I'm struck by how the site at Highland ties together these different issues of ecology, of labor, of political thought, and foreign policy. I'm historian Ben Bernard. Thank you for listening to Founding Footprints.
Founding Footprints is a VA 250 project. America, made in Virginia. This podcast is a production of the Virginia Audio Collective at WTJU 91.1 FM, hosted by Dr. Benjamin Bernard with sound design by Sage Tanguay and music provided by Blue Dot Sessions. If you'd like to explore the history of Charlottesville and Albemarle County, you can find more information at visitcharlottesville.org. Virginia is for history lovers.